saving statues from war. The fighting has left its mark on the city, even though downtown Kiev has so far been spared heavy shelling. It's mostly the elderly who are still in the capital.
I was born here. My mother was born here, and my grandmother. My great-grandmother lived here. I was here yesterday, and I'm here today. I am out and about. I have memories of every corner here, and I pray to God that I and all other residents of Kyiv will be all right. We have everything. There is heating, there's water, there's electricity. It would be a sin to complain. Of course, there are restrictions. The very fact that there is a war is terrible psychologically, but physically we are managing.
According to official estimates, half of the population has left. On the ground, it feels like more than that. Those that remain have been anxiously following the fighting. So far, the outer defenses have held. On Kiev's central Maidan Square, things are calm.
For weeks, Kiev has been fortified. People have prepared themselves for a possible Russian assault. But as the Russians are stored in front of the city, confidence is returning to the capital.
People are slowly returning to the streets. They're feeling more comfortable being outside. Businesses are now reopening. Some never closed their doors, like this coffee shop in the trendy Podil neighborhood. On the very first day of the war, the owner decided he had to stay. At 8 a.m., people came in and asked whether they could get a coffee. Usually we open at 12, but they looked at me in a way that I couldn't say no. Then even more people came, and that's when I understood many are leaving, but there are those who want to stay, and they need something to look forward to. Since then, the cafe has remained open. The staff have been donating meals to those in shelters and to the military. In a city where so many civilians have left, those in uniform are now among the most regular clients.
And Matthias, talks between Russia and Ukraine are taking place in Turkey today. The people that you're talking to, ordinary Ukrainians, do they still have any hope for a solution to this conflict?
We correspondents on the ground get asked this question every time that such talks are taking place, and the answer is always no. For most people here, it seems unlikely that a country that just invaded your country with full force would offer any meaningful compromise. These negotiations are, of course, important because they can solve day-to-day issues like the humanitarian corridors that have worked with mixed success, but something has been established, and they may be also important for both sides to feel the mood of the other side. But the guess here is that any result, any shape of an agreement will be decided on the battlefield, and it will reflect the situation on the battlefield, and it doesn't look like there is any decision yet, and there is no desire for by most Ukrainians to freeze the conflict in the state. It is now, with all these Russian troops inside the country, what the Ukrainian side has said, and that's backed by the population, is that the Russian troops would need to leave first, at least back to the places where they have been before February 24th. That means back into the separatist republics and onto Crimea.
Okay, DW correspondent Matthias Böninger reporting for us from Kyiv. And now to some of the other stories we're following for you this hour. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has once again pleaded for the West to provide fighter jets and tanks to help defend his country from Russian attacks. Zelensky accused Western countries of cowardice and warned that Russia's aggression would not stop in Ukraine, predicting that Russia would move against the Baltic states and Poland. Amnesty International has accused Russia of committing war crimes in Ukraine, likening the situation to his actions in the Syrian war. The human rights organization denounced Russia's deliberate attacks on civilian infrastructure in the country. Amnesty also accused Moscow of turning humanitarian corridors into death traps. G7 energy ministers have rejected demands by Russian President Vladimir Putin to pay for Russian gas with rubles. German Economy and Climate Protection Minister Robert Habeck said that the demand is unacceptable and called on companies not to comply with it. EU interior ministers have been meeting in Brussels to address the arrival of millions of refugees from Ukraine. They discussed a range of issues, such as the distribution of refugees across member states, as well as financial support. Poland alone has already taken in more than 2 million people. Over 300,000 refugees have made their way to Germany. We met one family that fled to Berlin. The husband's Tunisian nationality meant he could make the journey, in contrast to most Ukrainian men of conscription age who aren't allowed to leave the country.
We're in shock, like all Ukrainians who fled the war. We're afraid. We heard the sounds of the sirens and the bombs.
For 2 days, I couldn't believe I was in Berlin. I couldn't understand what was happening. I was in a state of shock.
On the day the war broke out, everyone ran down into their cellars.
When I hear helicopters, I think the war has come here. It stays with you, you know? An aircraft isn't what it was when you were a child, where you look up and think, wow, neat. Now, when you hear an aircraft, you think, we're at war. An aircraft is bad.
Everyone in Ukraine knows they could die at any moment. There's not a moment's rest or peace. I slept with all my clothes on. You hear the sirens, the planes approaching.
Whatever happens, I think the Russians will get their comeuppance for the deaths of the innocent children and people in Ukraine.
History won't forget this. People will remember how Russia behaved and what they've done.
For a moment, there was a lull, and we were able to escape. The train station was a nightmare. To be quite honest, I don't even think about the future. I think about my grandmother who stayed in Ukraine, and I think about what's going to happen next in our country. I want the war to stop right now.
Now we're trying, God willing, to forget our lives over there a bit. We hope we can be open enough to accept this new life.
Many Western companies have joined their governments in sanctioning Russia. German car maker Volkswagen is one of them. It's closed both of its production sites in the country, including its plant in Kaluga, which employs 4,000 people. We take a look at the effect sanctions are having on the lives of people there, and many of whom know little about their country's military operation in Ukraine.
Operations are at a standstill at Volkswagen's plant in Kaluga, a 3-hour drive from Moscow. Like many Western companies, VW has temporarily halted production in Russia, but there's no trace of panic among employees. Kaluga 2 is the name of the suburb. It's home to Dmitry Surusov and his wife. He started at VW as a welder. Now he's in quality control. The production stop has left him unfazed.
It's like a vacation. We're still getting paid, even though production has stopped. So everything is fine. It's a chance to relax, and soon we'll get back to work.
Food prices have gone up a bit, but it hasn't affected us much. We'll probably feel it more later. We've been through so much in Russia. A financial crisis, other crises. Nothing can scare us anymore.
Crimea, Volgograd, St. Petersburg. The couple likes to travel, though they've never been abroad. Dmitry renovates apartments as a side job to earn extra cash. He and his wife enjoy fishing videos on YouTube. They never watch the news.
You need to know what's happening in your own life, not what's going on in the world. You can find out about world events from neighbors or people at the supermarket.
In Kaluga, a lot of jobs are generated by the car industry. Aside from Volkswagen, the Volvo truck plant has also suspended production. McDonald's is closed, and Mercedes has stopped exports too. Will the country revert to cars made in Russia?
The problems are enormous, but our rulers insist that we can manage. Unfortunately, the public so far believes them. It's easier to convince ordinary people. They hide from the problems, and there's nothing at the moment that can be done about it.
Like many Russians, Dmitry and his wife only have a vague idea about their army's so-called special military operation in Ukraine.
It's only when the going gets rough for you that politics matters. As long as everything's all right, why should you be bothered?
This resort is a popular place to escape reality. A steam bath, and then a dip in ice-cold water. For some Russians, a welcome distraction from the problems they sense are looming on the horizon.
Military drones are an important weapon for both Ukraine and Russia in this war. The unmanned aircraft, they come in a variety of sizes. They can do everything from aerial surveillance to launching missiles. The United States is now sending ultralight switchblade drones to Ukraine. They're small enough to fit inside a backpack. They're able to strike targets with high precision.
An eye in the sky with a deadly payload. This is a promotional video by the maker of the Switchblade loitering munition. It hangs out in the air, sends images back for humans to figure out targets, then it becomes a missile. Switchblades are advertised online. They weigh just a few kilograms and can be launched from a small tube, requiring little setup or training. But it's the weapon system whose name cannot be spoken, at least by US officials.
I can't confirm particular systems the President did speak of, or we did speak of, tactical unmanned aerial systems. We provided and are providing 100 of those systems, but I'm just not in a position to speak to all the specific systems that may be included in that package.
Ukraine has already been using so-called loitering munitions to strike Russian forces. Turkish-made drones carried lightweight, laser-guided bombs. This footage reportedly shows the result of their strikes on Russian targets. Meanwhile, the Russian military has been using drones both big and small as part of its arsenal against Ukraine. This video shows the aftermath of an alleged drone missile strike on a science institute in Kyiv, and a small drone recovered at the scene. Will the Switchblades be a game changer? Some analysts say the US is sending too few of them, a supply that will only last a couple of days. But as Ukraine battles against the superior firepower of its invader, Ukrainians can use all the help they can get.
Well, good morning. I want to bring in Samuel Bendit. He's a Russian military technology analyst at the Center for Naval Analysis, and he's also with the Center for New American Security. Mr. Bendit, it's good to have you on the program. I want to talk drones with you in just a moment, but first, let me just ask you, when you look at the Russian military this week, in week 5 of this invasion, what do you see?
Well, good evening. Thanks for having me on the show. We're seeing the military that's beginning to reorganize and pull out the resources. It is a military that is essentially changing its mission set. It is a military that is reassessing its losses. It is admitting a lot of the losses. It is admitting loss of personnel, loss of equipment, but it is also the military that is tackling what it thinks are successes. The control of southern portions of Ukraine, control over Donbass, and multiple strikes on the Ukrainian industry, the defense industry, the economy, as well as on the civilians, that is essentially destroying a significant part of the country.
So, with that said, let's consider this drone technology. I mean, how are Ukraine and Russia both using this to their advantage in this war?
Well, as your report just mentioned, both countries use them as eyes in the sky. They're using them for gathering intelligence, conducting surveillance and reconnaissance. And that goes both for civilian commercial drones used by Ukrainians as well as military-grade drones used by the Russians. They're also using these drones to conduct strikes. Some drones can conduct both surveillance, reconnaissance, and strikes, such as the Turkish Bayraktar used by the Ukrainians, or the Forpost R and the Orion drones used by the Russians. There are also loitering munitions that are now used by the Russian forces, although probably with limited success. The only evidence so far are social media evidence of these drones falling without actually exploding. So both countries actually have a substantial drone force at their disposal, and each is trying to essentially guide its forces, guide its munitions at the adversary with the help of these UAVs.
And these drones also, particularly for the Russians, help to craft the narrative back home of what is going on in Ukraine, right? I mean, they're part of the storytellers now, aren't they?
That's correct. Initially, Russian forces have ceded the information environment to the Ukrainians, and there were a lot of videos of Bayraktar, the Turkish-made drones in the Ukrainian service. A lot of those videos were released on social media, multiplying each potential and realistic strike by these drones. And so Russian Ministry of Defense is trying to compete with that narrative. It is also releasing videos of their own military drones striking Ukrainian positions. It is releasing videos from surveillance drones, from military drones. And so each country is now trying to essentially craft a narrative that its forces are actually winning, its forces are hitting the enemy more and more accurately, and its forces are actually on the advance.
Do you see any parallels between Russian military strategy that we're seeing in Ukraine now compared with Russia's experience in Syria?
Well, that's not quite the same, I think. When Russian forces went into Syria, they were in a very permissive environment. They went up against the adversary that wasn't really able to fight back successfully, an adversary without air defenses, without early warning radars, and a lot of fighting for the Russian forces in Syria was actually done by their Syrian allies and the proxies. Here in Ukraine, Russian forces are up against an adversary with equal strength, and the Ukrainian military has shown incredible resilience and incredible strength in countering Russian military advances and blunting a lot of these advances across the country.
Mr. Bennett, we've heard, I guess, anecdotal evidence that Russian soldiers have been giving away their positions by using unprotected communications gadgets such as iPhones to call each other or even to FaceTime with relatives back home. And I'm wondering, are they doing that because they don't realize what they're doing, or are they doing that because in Syria they were able to do that and they didn't have to worry about their location being tracked?
Well, quite possibly in Syria, especially when it comes to the Russian military officers, they probably didn't have to worry about being tracked because a lot of that communication was conducted on Russian bases or at Syrian bases that were already secured by the Russian allies. Here in the field, there's a lot of confusion. A lot of Russian forces went in unprepared. A lot of them didn't actually get secure communication radios. They didn't get secure communication frequencies. Some of them are doing it to record what is happening. Some of them are actually trying to stay in contact with their relatives and loved ones, which is actually a violation of operational security, something that the Russian military has been drilling and exercising for. So it is very puzzling why so many Russian military personnel, especially its officers, are actually using commercial communications instead of secure military communications. I think this and other mysteries, this Russian way of war, are going to be reviewed and discussed at length once this fighting is over.
Let me just ask you too, Mr. Bennett, before we run out of time, if it's true that Russia underestimated the strength that's needed to defeat Ukraine with this first phase of the war, do you see it then possibly recalculating and maybe even overcompensating for the next onslaught, the next wave of attacks? Is that what the Ukrainians should be bracing for?
It is quite possible that the Russian military indeed underestimated their Ukrainian adversary. Ukrainians have been able to fight successfully at different directions against some of the Russian advances, and yes, we're probably seeing evidence that if Russian military will reassess its strength in several weeks, if it runs out of steam, if you will, and if it will take a break of sorts and re-up and rearm and essentially reallocate its forces, they may send in stronger contingents, bigger contingents with more missiles, more air force, and more ground forces as well. Again, this war and this conflict isn't necessarily over, but we might be seeing the end of one of the stages of this conflict at this point.
Yeah, we just hope that there won't be too many more stages to come. Samuel Bennett with the Center for Naval Analysis at the Center for New American Security. Mr. Bennett, we appreciate your time and your valuable analysis tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
NATO boosting its forces on its eastern flank in Europe. In the month since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the alliance has already doubled its troops levels in eastern Ukraine. In Eastern Europe, rather, about 40,000 troops are now under its direct command. That force includes battle groups of up to 1,500 soldiers in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. Now, NATO wants to station units in 4 additional countries like Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said the measures were part of a reset in response to a new reality.
Today, NATO leaders agreed to reset our deterrence and defense for the longer term, to face a new security reality. We will have substantially more forces in the eastern part of the alliance at higher readiness. 1 month since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, NATO's security environment has fundamentally changed for the long haul. And we are responding with more troops, with more air assets and more maritime capabilities. It's a new reality, it's a new normal, and NATO is responding for the long term.
U.S. President Joe Biden is in Brussels to meet with European allies in person. He pledged to support those fleeing the fighting in Ukraine and announced new sanctions on individuals linked to the Russian regime. He also said Vladimir Putin has underestimated the resolve and unity of NATO.
Today marks 1 month since Russia began its carnage in Ukraine, the brutal invasion of Ukraine. Putin was banking on NATO being split. My early conversation with him in December and early January was clear to me he didn't think we could sustain this cohesion. NATO has never been more united than it is today. Putin is getting exactly the opposite of what he intended to have as a consequence of going into Ukraine. We have to stay fully, totally, thoroughly united. Thank you.
Our first guest is Alexander Stubb, a former Prime Minister of Finland. Currently, he's a professor at the European University Institute. Welcome to the day. Now, your country is in the European Union, but not in NATO. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for the first time, most Finns say they want to join the alliance. Is your country preparing to apply for membership?
Yeah, I guess the right way to put it is that we're not in NATO yet. Yes, I predict that Finland will file an application for NATO membership, not in days, not in weeks, but within a few months. We basically had a reversal of opinion polls. Used to be 50% against, 20 in favor. Now it's 62% in favor and 16 against. So we have a parliamentary procedure, and we are going to join NATO at the end of the day.
And joining NATO is because you and your country fear that Putin's goals of empire extend beyond Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, I've been a minority in advocating Finnish membership ever since 1995, but now I think our population is rightly so being driven by what I call rational fear. So the thought is that, listen, if Putin can slaughter his brothers, sisters, and cousins in Ukraine, why wouldn't he do the same thing with Finland? And I think that the sentiment that we have is that we never want to be alone again, like we were in the Winter War against the Soviet Union. So therefore the population is in favor of NATO membership.
Let's talk a little bit about sanctions. We've seen sanctions in finance, in transport, in the world of sports even, energy too. But there are continuous calls from inside Ukraine, particularly from President Zelensky, for an oil and gas embargo. How vital would this step be?
I think it would be vital, and obviously we've seen 3 or 4 are coming up with 5 waves of sanctions. The way in which I see it is that Russia will be utterly isolated by the end of this. That means political, economic, financial, sport, culture, and energy isolation. So I foresee first an oil embargo, and then basically step-by-step movement away from Russian gas. I think that's the only right thing to do.
Do you think an oil embargo would push Vladimir Putin to bend because that would hamper his economy severely, or is he fully on a legacy-defining mission in Ukraine right now?
I think it's very much about his legacy, his place in history. You know, he wants to see himself next to Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, or Stalin, and he'll be doing everything in his power to achieve that. And I do think that, you know, going for oil embargoes and gas embargoes, they will probably hasten the process of isolating him. But will that change his mind? I'm not 100% sure it will, but I still think that we need to be on the right side of history here.
You believe in instilling some kind of embargo, but here in Germany, the government is unwilling to block Russian energy given its dependence on Moscow. Berlin says this war marked a turning point, but it can't turn fast enough for Ukraine. What do you hope Germany does in this conflict with regard to this oil embargo?
Step by step, I think, and you know, I come from a country with 1,340 kilometers of border, and the way in which we set up our energy portfolio was to make sure that we would not be dependent on Russia. That's why we have nuclear. That's why we never did anything like the Energiewende. So I would say that go for the oil embargo first, and then, because you can get oil from different kinds of places in the world. Yeah, we're going to have to pay a higher price. And then start weaning yourself off of the gas. In Finland, actually, gas is only for the industry, so we don't do any housing on that. So it's, I guess, a bit easier for a Finn to say than for a German. And I must also say that as a professor, it's easy to analyze this stuff from the audience. It's a bit more difficult when you're in the middle of it and taking those decisions.
Now, there are negotiations ongoing between Russia and Ukraine right now. We continue to hear talk, though, of so-called Finlandization of Ukraine, that under duress, the smaller neighbor is essentially forced to accept Moscow's influence and pledge neutrality. What do you say to people who suggest this as a way out of this war?
Well, you know, I love Germany, but there's one phrase from Germany that I don't love, and that's Finlandization. I think it was coined by a German professor in 1966. My answer is absolutely no solution to anything. And you have to understand that for us Finns, Finlandization is actually a little bit of an insult. It's a sore point in our history. We had to compromise our liberties, we had to compromise our democracy, we had to compromise our security. So it is absolutely no solution for Ukraine. Basta.
Your country certainly knows about the difficulties of making such a step, and we've heard President Zelensky say that he too is not willing to compromise. Now, diplomacy, let's talk about that. Is there space here to maneuver when Putin's demands are simply unacceptable to Ukraine?
Well, to be honest, I mean, my experience comes from the war in Georgia in 2008, and I was Finland's foreign minister at the time, and also chairman of the OSCE. So I flew into Tbilisi with French Foreign Minister Bernard Kouchner, and we mustered a ceasefire agreement in 5 days. It had 6 points. But to be honest, the stakes were much lower at the time. It was easier for President Medvedev at the time and Prime Minister Putin to accept that. I don't think there's room of maneuver for a ceasefire agreement at the moment. So it's the moment when idealism, in other words, peace, hits reality, in other words, war. I just don't see where they could actually get closer. And as I said, Putin will destroy Ukraine. That's his aim. And Zelensky will fight back. And at the end of the day, we'll see who is the last man standing.
Alexander Stubb, a former Prime Minister of Finland, thank you very much for your time and your insights.
My pleasure.
After a month of war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has bogged down, reportedly. With the ground offensive stalled in several places, the Russian military has been increasingly targeting civilian infrastructure. Yet, despite the huge number of Ukrainians suffering, the country's military has so far been able to keep Russian forces at bay against all odds.
Flames and smoke billowing from a Russian transport ship in the harbor of Russian-occupied Berdyansk. Lines for humanitarian aid stretching in front of bombed-out apartment blocks in the heavily struck city of Mariupol. A month into Russia's war in Ukraine, every day is full of images that only weeks ago were difficult, if not impossible, to imagine in modern Europe. The sun was shining in Kiev, and no bombs were falling for the moment as soldiers and civilians reflected on a month of war.
Ukrainians are united as never before, perhaps. This makes me very happy. And the Russians made a big mistake coming after our country, our land. We will bite their throats. It's our homeland. Morale is as high as on the first day, and it will remain so until the last day, Victory Day. We remain determined.
Ukraine has proven its resilience, but sustained bombardment, bodies in the streets, and life in bomb shelters with limited or no power or heat are bound to take their toll on even the bravest.
I feel hopelessness. One doesn't know what to do next, how to behave. I try to keep calm and only hope that everything will be over, and all will be fine as it was before, and to see the smiles return to people's faces, and our chances to enjoy life return to us.
A month ago, no one knew how long Ukraine could hold out against Russia. And yet, despite the toll to human life and infrastructure, and the sheer size of the Russian war machine, the underdog is still standing.
Our correspondent Matthias Berlinger is in Kyiv and sent us this assessment.
We have just returned to Kyiv. We've been away for a week in the western part of the country, and the mood has changed slightly here. We see more shops open. For example, hairdressers are open now. They used to be closed. Most of the shops are still closed, but a few more businesses are operating. You see more people on the street. You see more traffic. So it feels like the city is making its way back to normalcy in very small steps. It is, of course, still a city in an extraordinary situation. You can still hear shelling and in daytime and at night from the outskirts. The Ukrainians have driven the Russians a bit further away from the city. That's at least what we hear, but the fighting is close enough that you can hear it even if you are in the city center. However, there seems to be like the trend seems to have shifted a little bit. That's the feeling here on the ground. The Russian troops have tried to capture Kiev. Everybody understands quickly. They have almost been unable to make gains within 3 weeks or so, and we've also seen some signs that they are digging trenches now, that this is moving towards a war of attrition rather than an invasion or an advance, and that's obviously something that gives people here the hope that the
Perfect time.